Hello and welcome to another edition of James and Chris Science videos, where today we're going to be looking at how we organise all the different species that exist on the planet Earth and how we start to group them into similarities, according to their similarities. So I'm going to start off with just this little bit of research that I was kind of looking at, and this is a news article that was out in the BBC about 5 years ago now, where they were counting the number of species they predicted they would find on the planet Earth. And through their different gene sequencing and various different methods, they came to the conclusion that they reckon there are 8.7 billion species living on the planet Earth, of which we probably can categorise 1.7 million. And that's incredible. That means there's like 90% of, well, no, more than that, 99% of all living things we haven't yet discovered or seen. Now, I've put a little graphic here, which, again, it just shows how far we've got to go. On the left-hand side, it says species witnessed by taxonomic groups, which just means that how many we think there are. And so you take the brown-coloured, and that's how many we think we are. But the blue-coloured are the ones that we've discovered. And so we think there are huge numbers out there that we are yet to discover. And you can see almost, 99.5% of viruses we've not yet covered, studied, found. Nematoda are types of worms, and so on. So it's incredible. You notice that mammals, chordates, mammals, birds, fishes, etc. at the bottom, there's it's termed as a group, it's a really small group of species, whereas insects, you can see how many more different types of insects there are. Right, let's go through some of the history. This screen, we've got a guy called Carl Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist back in the 18th century. And he was the first one, really, to describe and categorise living things into groups. And he called them Animalia and Vegetala, which just stands for animals and vegetables. He did have a third group, and the third group was for non-living things. So he spent a lot of time categorising rocks as not being living, for example. But he was the first one that came up with that kind of categorization, and he started to put the living species that he found into those groups. Now, it's moved on a bit since then. Since Linnaeus, we've had various different scientists, Haeckel, Schatten, all the way up to Ruggiero and to the modern systems, that have tried to change the groups. And we've ended up with, the current system has got 7 kingdoms and 2 empires. I'll talk about empires very briefly. But we are much more precise now about how we group the living organisms into these kingdoms. Now, for us, the wording of the exam syllabus says that the kingdoms you need to learn about at the moment are animal, plant, fungi, protists, and bacteria. So I've kind of simplified some of the words for how they sound. So where it says Animalia, we just put animals as a simpler way of writing it. We don't need to do the empires yet, but the empires are basically whether it's got a nucleus or not. And we've done nucleuses with animal cells. So I'm going to go through each of those, and you're going to write some notes. So you're going to need to set up. And to set up, I would like you to get either a sheet of paper, or you can do this in OneNote. I don't mind. The choice is yours. And once you've got your page, I want you to split it into 6 equal areas like so. Now there's 5 areas where you can put in little titles, so animal, plant, fungi, protists, bacteria. You can leave the last one blank for any extra notes that you want to do. And as I go through the description of each of these kingdoms, I'd like you to write some notes, maybe put in some pictures, maybe give examples, and expand on what we talk about. Right, here we go. First one is the animal kingdom, and you'll find the first thing we're going to look at each time is going to be the cells. The cells are going to be the first thing we look at. They're going to be our first indication on what type of kingdom we're looking at. Now, we've covered cells before in a previous video, but animal cells contain principally 4 things. They've got the cytoplasm, nucleus, mitochondria, and membrane. There are certain criteria that enable us to put living organisms, the animal groups, and they are whether, I've put at the bottom, this is direct from Wiki, animals consume organic material. In other words, they have to eat. They can't make their own food, which some other organisms can. We breathe oxygen or take oxygen out of water through gills. We're able to move. We can only produce sexually, and that's will mean something as you go through schools, the difference between sexually and asexually. Basically, you need two parents in order to produce an offspring. Some living organisms can just reproduce on their own, and that's called asexually. But for animals, you need two different parents in order to produce offspring. They also have more than one cell. They're multicellular. They've got specialized cells that do different things. So you have muscle cells, you have nerve cells, and so on. So we are multicellular. Moving on, we've got the plant kingdom. So you'll immediately notice the difference between the cells on this one. And a plant cell has more organelles in it than an animal cell. You'll see you've got chloroplasts, vacuole, and a cell wall as being three extra things that the plant cell has got. If you want to know more about them, please look at my video on plant and animal cells, and that will tell you more about what each of those parts does. Now, green plants are called plants because they are able to make their own food, and they do this via light using a process called photosynthesis, and that will take place in the chloroplast, which has got a green pigment called chlorophyll. So we indicate plants by that ability to photosynthesize, and they will be a green colour. We'll move on to Fungi Kingdom, and we'll again look at the cell here. And where do you think, when scientists first discovered fungi and mushrooms and yeast, of which of the two kingdoms they put them in? They had a choice of plant or animal, vegetable or animal. And the early scientists always put fungi into the plant. If you look at the cell, you can kind of see why. It's got a vacuole and it's got a cell wall, which are both indicators of plants. But there are some differences that you need to know about. The first of which, the cell wall contains something called chitin. And chitin is the same material as found in your fingernails. It's a slightly tougher material. Unlike plants have something called cellulose. This is a slightly different format for how they're made. The second is that they cannot photosynthesize. So if they can't photosynthesize, like animals, they need to be able to eat something. So they have to find things to eat, and they generally find dead things and rot them. They're part of the detritivore group that get rid of dead things. They can be one cell, they can be many cells. A single-celled fungi would be something like yeast, whereas the multi-celled fungi would be something like a mushroom. So those are fungi. We'll move on to protozoa. Protozoa are animals of a kind, but because they are only ever one cell big, you can't call them an animal. You can't put them in the animal group. So they've got their own group. They were in the animal kingdom for a long time, but now they're on their own. They will do all the things animals can do. They can move, they can eat, they digest. The cells are the same. The only difference is that they are one cell big. They live mostly in water because they're only one cell big. It's very difficult for them to maintain and keep water. So you will find most of those living in liquids. Bacteria is one of the latest kingdoms, well, the later kingdoms, because they're so small. Scientists didn't know about them till the 20th century. And then once they discovered bacteria, then real advance in medicine came, because then we could start to know how to deal with them. And we had obviously the invention of antibiotics through Fleming, and various different kind of advances to medicines that were able to exist because we knew about bacteria. Now, they are tiny, really small, only a few micrometers in length. You could fit thousands of them into one human cell. And they come in 3 different shapes, which is quite cool. You get a rod-shaped, which looks like that. We get spherical shaped, and then we get a lovely spiral shaped. We kind of become programmed to think that all bacteria is bad, but majority of bacteria actually is really useful, and without them, life on Earth would be very difficult. They do things like rot away dead materials. Without them, leaves would stay on the ground for a lot longer. They also are used in many, many industrial processes. For example, cheese is turned into cheese from milk using bacteria. It's bacteria that does that process. And that enables the milk to form into a slightly different chemical, and then that's what we then eat as cheese. I've put, for the next bit, why viruses are not in a kingdom. And this is quite important, particularly in the current climate where we're living through coronavirus, of why viruses are not considered living organisms, and they don't qualify for being as live. So what you've got to do is go back to the Mrs. Gren's, and that's how we qualify something's alive, whether it moves, respires, senses, grows, reproduces, excretes, and performs some form of nutrition. In terms of viruses, they don't respire, they don't move, they don't grow, they don't sense, and they don't eat. They produce no waste. In fact, they don't really reproduce. They hijack a human cell or an animal cell or a plant cell, and they change the DNA, and they get that cell to make new versions of the virus. So viruses are very odd in that manner, that you cannot classify them as living organisms. They are something different. Well, they're viruses, which is not a living organism. So let's summarise. There are many, many, many billions of species on the planet Earth, of which we don't know about most of them. A great story about a scientist in London decided to, in his back garden, dig a hole and count how many species. And within 3 days, he'd identified 6 new species just in his back garden in London in 3 days. So they're out there. Most of the undiscovered organisms are insects, viruses, and bacteria. So you have to go microscopic to see a lot of them. Cells are the best way to put organisms into kingdoms. You look at the cells first. If it's got a cell wall, that's going to give you some indications of where it goes. If it's got chloroplasts, you know it's going to be in the plant kingdom. If it's multicellular and only contains cytoplasmic nucleus membrane and mitochondria, then you know it's going to be an animal. And so the cells are going to be our key way of identifying the kingdom. For the ISEB and keystage 3 syllabus, you need to know the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the fungi, protists, protozoa is the plural, and bacteria. Protozoa is the singular. Bacteria are the 5 that you need to know, and you need to be able to say something about each of those different kingdoms. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.